Welcome to my channel, and today I want to share a story that will make you rethink the way you view power, respect, and business. This story is about a woman who turned the tables on an empire, not with anger or violence, but with a single calculated move. It's about Ava Mwangi, a CEO who, with grace and precision, brought down a powerful corporation that had underestimated her. In this story, you'll witness how one moment of disrespect can cost billions, and how true power is not always about making the loudest noise, but about knowing when to walk away. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand why sometimes, in business, the most powerful move you can make is simply refusing to shake hands. In the high-rise conference room of the esteemed Mwangi Group, the glass walls gleamed with the brilliance of the morning sun, casting long shadows on the sleek mahogany table where 12 top executives sat in stiff silence. At the helm of the room, Victoria Okoye, chairwoman of Mwangi Group, adjusted her papers with deliberate slowness, as if preparing to deliver a final, irreversible decision. Across from her sat Ava Mwangi, the CEO of Mwangi Investments, her composed demeanor matching the grandeur of the building she had helped finance. Ava was no stranger to power. She had clawed her way to the top of a multi-billion-dollar empire, her firm's influence spreading across industries and continents. Today was supposed to be the culmination of a long-awaited merger between Mwangi Investments and Mwangi Group, a deal worth 2.4 billion shillings that would revolutionize the business landscape. But Victoria had other plans. She was determined to make Ava feel the weight of her privilege, to remind her that power still had its gatekeepers. The moment Ava rose from her seat and extended her hand across the polished table, her expression calm yet firm, Victoria's lips twisted into a smile that was anything but welcoming. "We don't shake hands with people like you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. The room fell into an eerie stillness, punctuated only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. The men in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances, some awkwardly shifting in their seats, while others let out nervous chuckles. Cameras from the live investor stream captured the entire moment: Ava's outstretched hand, the dismissal, the cruel laughter that followed. But what they didn't know was that Ava's hand, now slowly retracting, was far from a symbol of weakness. It was a quiet prelude to something much larger, something that no one in the room could anticipate. Ava's voice broke the silence, calm and unyielding. "Understood," she said softly, her gaze never leaving Victoria's. She sat back down, her eyes scanning the room, noting every face, every flicker of insecurity behind those cold masks. Victoria, satisfied with her small victory, turned to the screen and began her presentation. The merger was supposed to go smoothly, but Victoria's need to dominate the room, to belittle her guest, turned the meeting into a spectacle, a theater of arrogance and cruelty. Every time Ava spoke, Victoria interrupted with dismissive corrections, her words sharp and designed to provoke. When Ava's analysts presented projections, Victoria mocked them, calling their numbers over-ambitious and unrealistic. The men around the table laughed in support, emboldened by the chairwoman's aggression. But Ava didn't flinch. She took notes, her silence like a storm brewing beneath the surface. When Victoria leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension, she said, "Miss Mwangi, you'll learn that this industry doesn't reward emotional ambition." Her smile almost triumphant. Ava nodded, her expression unchanged, but inside, a plan was already set in motion. At 3:17 p.m., when the meeting broke for a brief recess, Ava stepped into the hallway and dialed a single number. Her voice was measured, cool. "Execute Clause 8.3, effective immediately." There was no explanation, no hint of emotion, just a simple command, the kind of move that would cost Victoria everything. As Ava returned to the boardroom, the tension in the air was palpable. Victoria barely glanced up, pretending the unease wasn't there. "Where were we?" she asked, feigning ignorance, but Ava's gaze locked with hers, unwavering. "At the part where arrogance becomes expensive," she said softly. Victoria's frown deepened, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to dismiss Ava's words. But before she could speak, the room erupted into chaos. Phones buzzed in rapid succession, screens lighting up with red alerts. The CFO, his face drained of color, looked up from his phone, his voice quaking with disbelief. "Chairwoman, it's gone," he said, his eyes wide with shock. "Mwangi Investments has withdrawn all funds, 2.4 billion shillings, effective immediately." Panic swept through the room like wildfire. The executives shouted over each other, questions flying in every direction. Victoria, her confidence shattered, whipped her head toward Ava, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't do this," she stammered, her voice cracking under the pressure. Ava, calm as ever, simply replied, "I can." Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of 1,000 decisions. 1,000 careful moves made over months of planning. "Clause 8.3 was signed by your legal team. It allows for immediate withdrawal if misconduct is documented during negotiations," Ava said, her gaze shifting toward the camera in the corner, still recording the whole meeting for the investor stream. "And I believe we have all the documentation we need." Victoria's face turned a sickly shade of white, her mouth opening and closing in silent rage. "You have no idea what you've just done," she seethed. Ava stood, her expression unreadable. "I've protected my capital from contamination," she said simply. The room descended into frantic whispers. One executive scrambled to call the PR department, another frantically checked the stock ticker on the wall, which had already started sliding downward. Within minutes, financial networks exploded with the news. "Mwangi Investments withdraws 2.4 billion shillings from Mwangi Group. Corporate crisis unfolds." Ava turned to leave the room, her steps deliberate, and as she reached the door, she paused, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "For future reference," she said, her gaze cold, "respect is cheaper than recovery." She turned and left, leaving behind a room in shambles, the sounds of a collapsing empire echoing in her wake. As Ava left the conference room, her footsteps echoed down the sterile, glass-lined hallway of Langston Tower. The tension inside the boardroom was still palpable, like a pressure cooker on the verge of explosion. The security cameras in the hall caught her composed figure, her back straight, her eyes focused ahead, as if she were walking out of a room she had already conquered. The weight of her actions had not yet settled on her, but the storm was already brewing behind her. Back in the boardroom, the sound of shuffling papers, frantic phone calls, and panicked voices filled the air as the executives scrambled to comprehend what had just happened. Victoria remained frozen, her body rigid in the seat, her gaze fixed on the empty chair across the table where Ava had just been seated. The other executives stood, whispering among themselves, some muttering about potential damage control, while others, pale and wide-eyed, stared at their phones in disbelief. The CFO, still holding his phone, his face ashen, turned to Victoria with a look of helplessness. This wasn't just a business move, Chairwoman. This is catastrophic. The withdrawal is irreversible." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria's grip tightened on the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "Fix this," she growled, the command dripping with venom. But no one could offer a solution. Ava had already won. There was no coming back from this. The deal was dead, the money was gone, and the live stream had captured every second of it, every humiliating moment. Minutes turned to hours as the executives scrambled to salvage what they could. The stock ticker continued to fall, and with each passing second, the magnitude of the loss became more evident. Mwangi Group's valuation was hemorrhaging, spiraling downward in real time. The news outlets were already calling it the handshake collapse, and every major financial network was dissecting the drama in the boardroom, speculating about what would happen next. By the time Victoria's secretary entered the room with news of the rapidly deteriorating markets, she was no longer the confident leader who had walked in just hours ago. Her facade of control had shattered. "Chairwoman," the secretary said, her voice trembling. "Mwangi Group's stock has dropped 38%. The investors are pulling out. The bank is calling in the loans. We're in a crisis." Victoria's mind raced as the walls of the room seemed to close in. She had prided herself on being a master of negotiation, a woman who had risen to the top by bending others to her will, by playing the game better than anyone else. But today, Ava had rewritten the rules, and Victoria had fallen victim to her own arrogance. She had tried to humiliate Ava, to remind her of her place, And in doing so, she had made a fatal mistake. Ava was not a woman to be underestimated. "Call the investors," Victoria demanded, her voice now tight with panic. "Tell them we can renegotiate. We can fix this." But as the secretary dialed the numbers, it became clear that the phone calls were futile. The withdrawal was final. There was no amount of sweet-talking, no desperate plea that could reverse the damage. The board members were already abandoning ship. One by one, they filed out of the room, murmuring apologies or excuses, unable to stomach the collapse of the empire they had once been proud to serve. At the same time, Ava was already in her office, watching the developments unfold on the live news feed. Her expression remained calm, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she leaned back in her chair. The quiet satisfaction that washed over her was not from the victory itself, but from the knowledge that she had maintained her dignity, her composure, even in the face of such blatant disrespect. She had played the long game, and now the consequences were unraveling in real time. Ava didn't need to rub it in. She didn't need to gloat. The world would see the truth soon enough. By the time the evening news broadcasted the headlines, Mwangi Group in crisis. After $2.4 billion withdrawal, the damage was done. The press conferences were held, but no one could control the narrative. Investors were in a panic. The stock markets were rattled. Victoria's empire, built on years of hard work and manipulation, was crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As midnight approached, the story of Victoria's downfall began to take on a life of its own. Social media platforms exploded with commentary, memes, and discussions about the handshake collapse, many of them featuring the now infamous clip of Ava's outstretched hand, the insult, and the calculated response that followed. The world had seen how power could be wielded with quiet precision, how a single decision could bring down the mightiest of titans. But Ava's statement, the one that would echo in business circles for years to come, was brief and to the point. "Partnerships end when respect does," she had said, and that was all the world needed to hear. The next morning, business schools and corporate analysts began dissecting the events in Langston Tower, offering lessons on respect, power, and the delicate nature of professional relationships. As they pored over the events of that fateful day, one truth became clear. Ava had not just won the battle. She had redefined the rules of engagement. In boardrooms across the world, women who had once been dismissed, overlooked, or marginalized replayed that clip and whispered her name with reverence. They understood the message she had sent. Respect couldn't be bought, but it could be commanded. It could be earned, but it could also be taken away. And in this new world of business, power didn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply stopped shaking hands. By morning, the media frenzy surrounding Mwangi Group's collapse had reached unprecedented levels. News outlets scrambled to cover the fallout, reporting live from Langston Tower as the stock tickers, flashing in real time, continued to reflect the unraveling of what had once been one of the most powerful companies in the world. Across the globe, the story of Ava Mwangi's quiet vengeance, her ability to take down an empire with nothing more than calculated grace and a single withdrawn handshake, became the stuff of legend. Financial analysts and corporate experts began to dissect the events of the boardroom, their analysis ranging from praise for Ava's cold and composed brilliance to a more cynical reading of corporate manipulation. But no one could deny the most important takeaway. Ava had changed the game. In every major city, boardrooms were filled with hushed conversations. Across Africa, from the towering skyscrapers of Johannesburg to the bustling business districts of Lagos, women in executive positions who had been overlooked, sidelined, or belittled found themselves empowered. Ava's actions had shown them something that few women in power had ever dared to express. True power was not about the outward show of force, the loud proclamation of control, or the constant need for validation. Power was about choice. Power was about understanding that no one had the ability to dismiss you if you knew your worth, if you commanded respect, and most importantly, if you were willing to walk away. Back in Victoria, Okoye's office, the days following the collapse were a blur of chaos. The phone calls never stopped. She had spent the better part of the morning speaking with her PR team, trying in vain to control the narrative, to salvage what remained of her empire's reputation. But it was clear, the damage had already been done. The media had already painted her as the villain in this corporate drama, a woman who had miscalculated and let her ego destroy everything she had built. Meanwhile, Ava's stock had only risen higher. Not only had she withdrawn the $2.4 billion from Mwangi Group, but she had managed to make the world see it as a lesson in corporate ethics, a case study in how to wield influence with precision and intelligence. Ava sat at her desk, staring out over the cityscape from the 50th floor of Mwangi Investments headquarters. The world had already written its story, but Ava knew the journey was far from over. The withdrawal was just one move in a much larger game. She had played her cards carefully, not just with Victoria, but with the entire industry. By walking away, by severing the deal in such a final, irreversible way, Ava had set a new precedent. No longer would women in business be forced to prove their worth by playing the same old games. The days of trying to fit into spaces carved out by men were over. Ava had drawn the line in the sand. She had defined her own terms. But Ava was no stranger to controversy. She knew that the consequences of her actions were far-reaching. There would be those who praised her, those who saw her as a champion of respect and dignity in an often cutthroat world. But there would also be those who saw her as dangerous, as someone who was willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of principle. As her firm's stock soared and Mwangi Group's spiraled, the financial world began to take notice. Ava's actions had forced the market to recalibrate, to reconsider the value of ethics in business. It was a shift in the narrative that would have long-lasting implications. Within weeks, her name had become synonymous with power, grace, and vengeance. Young professionals, particularly women, began to use her as a reference point for their own careers, citing her as a model of self-respect and strategic thinking. In boardrooms and offices across Africa, the phrase "never shake hands when you know your worth" became a silent motto. A reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, could diminish your value if you didn't let them. But Ava wasn't interested in fame or accolades. Her victory wasn't about the public adoration or the whispers of respect in business circles. It was about the choice she had made. The choice to stand her ground when everything seemed to be against her. To remove herself from the game when the stakes were at their highest. Meanwhile, Victoria sat in her penthouse office overlooking the sprawling city of Lagos, the same city where her empire had been born. She had spent the last few weeks trying to salvage her name, issuing statements that denied any wrongdoing, trying to explain that the collapse was an unfortunate series of events that were beyond her control. But it was clear to everyone watching, her reputation was in tatters. The corporate world had no room for weakness, especially when it was broadcasted live for all to see. Investors fled. Banks demanded repayment of loans. Stock prices continued to plummet. Every attempt at damage control seemed to make things worse. By the time the company announced a massive restructuring effort, it was too late. The board had begun discussing the possibility of selling Mwangi Group's remaining assets, a last-ditch effort to stay afloat. For Victoria, this was more than just a financial collapse. It was personal. She had always prided herself on being a master manipulator, a woman who could control any situation with her charm, her intellect, and her iron will. But Ava Mwangi had exposed her vulnerabilities, had shown her that no amount of money or power could protect her from the consequences of her own arrogance. Ava had been right. Victoria had miscalculated, and now she was paying the price. In a final attempt to regain some semblance of control, Victoria reached out to Ava, requesting a private meeting. Ava, however, had already moved on. She wasn't interested in negotiating with someone who had once dismissed her so openly. Instead, she focused on expanding her empire, building relationships with those who understood the true meaning of respect, those who saw her not just as a businesswoman, but as a force to be reckoned with. The business world had watched the drama unfold, and now they understood the most important lesson of all. Respect wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, and when it was lost, it could never truly be regained. The aftermath of Ava Mwangi's decisive move continued to reverberate throughout the business world. As weeks passed, the financial media shifted its focus from the collapse of Mwangi Group to to the broader implications of Ava's actions. Business pundits, once skeptical of Ava's boldness, began to credit her with reshaping corporate norms. Universities began offering lectures on her strategic brilliance, and business students from across the globe now studied the handshake collapse as a case of power, respect, and the politics of influence. Ava had demonstrated that it wasn't enough to simply be competent. In the high-stakes world of business, you had to command respect, not just from others, but from yourself. Back in Mwangi Group's headquarters, things had only worsened. The leadership shakeup was swift, as the board's loyalty to Victoria Okoye began to erode. No one could deny that she had once been a formidable force in the business world, but after the disastrous livestream and her failure to salvage the situation, her reputation had been irrevocably damaged. The board began discussions of a buyout. Mwangi Group was looking to sell off assets, liquidate parts of the company, and cut its losses. Victoria, once at the apex of power, now found herself sidelined, her influence waning like the dying embers of a fire. However, for Ava, this wasn't just about winning a single battle. It was a part of a much larger strategy. While the press focused on her corporate coup, she quietly expanded her empire, focusing on strategic investments in emerging markets across Africa. Ava was no longer just a CEO, she was a symbol of the new order. In boardrooms across the continent, there were murmurs about her. The woman who had changed everything without raising her voice. Ava's next move was swift and calculated. She knew the value of timing in business, and she had learned the lesson from watching the collapse of Mwangi Group. As investors fled from Mwangi, she quietly acquired a controlling stake in several of their subsidiaries. The very companies Victoria had once looked down upon, seeing them as small players in a game of giants, were now a part of Ava's growing portfolio. The irony was not lost on her. She had dismantled the empire of her adversary while simultaneously absorbing its assets. Ava's empire was becoming a network of thriving, interconnected businesses. And every acquisition sent a signal to the market. Respect in business was a currency, and Ava had the highest stakes. Meanwhile, Victoria, who had once commanded the respect of powerful men and women, was now scrambling to regain her footing. The collapse of Mwangi Group had left her with little more than the remnants of her once proud empire. She had become a cautionary tale. Her arrogance had cost her everything, and now she was forced to rebuild, but without the same network of allies, the same influence, or the same credibility she once enjoyed. The banks and investors who had once admired her for her ruthlessness now distanced themselves, watching her every move with suspicion. Victoria had learned, too late, that power in business was not just about financial control. It was about relationships, trust, and the respect of your peers. Without those, everything else was meaningless. As for Ava, she continued to rise. The success of her investments, her growing network, and her undeniable influence led to her becoming a regular fixture at high-profile business events. It wasn't long before she was invited to speak at international summits, where she shared her insights on the importance of self-respect, strategic thinking, and the dynamics of power. Ava never wasted a word in her speeches. Her ideas were always clear, sharp, and impactful, and each one resonated deeply with those in the room. It was at one of these events, a global economic summit held in Johannesburg, that Ava found herself face-to-face with a group of investors who had once been hesitant to work with her. Now they sought her out, eager to partner with her, to tap into the success she had cultivated. Ava, however, wasn't in the business of just making deals. She wasn't looking to expand her network for the sake of growth alone. She had learned that in the world of business, integrity and respect were the true pillars of success. Ava didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Instead, she carefully selected her partners, aligning herself with those who valued the same principles she did: transparency, mutual respect, and a commitment to ethical business practices. Behind the scenes, as her empire grew, Ava also began to advocate for women in business, using her platform to highlight the barriers women often faced in male-dominated industries. She had not forgotten the subtle cruelty she had endured in that boardroom, the dismissal, the mockery, the laughter that followed. Ava's mission was clear: to break down the barriers that still existed for women in leadership, and to ensure that the next generation of businesswomen would never have to fight for respect in the way she had. She partnered with NGOs, spoke at universities, and mentored young women who showed promise in the corporate world. Her goal was to empower, to teach others the value of patience, intelligence, and self-respect. Ava was no longer just a CEO. She was a movement, a symbol of everything that was possible when women took control of their narrative. As the year drew to a close, Ava stood at the forefront of a new wave of corporate leadership. The business world had learned its lesson. Respect was no longer a commodity to be bargained for. It was a principle that could not be violated without consequence. In the quiet offices and bustling boardrooms around the world, the story of the handshake collapse was told and retold. Business leaders of all kinds from Africa to America understood that Ava's message had been crystal clear. True power wasn't about how loudly you could speak or how ruthlessly you could control the people around you. Power came from within, from the ability to know your worth, to stand firm in the face of disrespect and to walk away when the cost of staying was too high. For Ava Mwangi, it had all been worth it. The empire she had built, the principles she had stood by, and the respect she had earned were worth more than any financial gain. The world had watched as she dismantled a corporate giant, not with anger or violence, but with quiet dignity. And in doing so, she had forever changed the way business was done. Respect, she knew, was the ultimate form of power, and she was its rightful owner. The months that followed the collapse of Mwangi Group solidified Ava Mwangi's place in corporate history. News outlets and financial analysts who had once dismissed her rise as the product of luck or circumstance now acknowledged her as a master strategist, one who had not only navigated the turbulent waters of business with unparalleled precision, but had also reshaped the landscape for generations to come. Ava's story had become more than just a cautionary tale or a success story. It was the foundation for a new era of leadership, one where respect, dignity, and strategic acumen were more valuable than brute force and ruthless power. Ava's influence spread beyond just the corporate world. She became a trusted advisor to global organizations, governments, and philanthropic ventures. Her reputation as a visionary leader who had maintained her integrity while navigating high-stakes mergers, acquisitions, and partnerships earned her the respect of both the business and political spheres. As the chairwoman of Mwangi Investments, she led not only with intellect, but with a clear sense of ethics that had become rare in a world increasingly obsessed with wealth at any cost. Her philosophy was simple. Business should serve society, not the other way around. Her investments now spanned continents, with Mwangi Investments holding stakes in renewable energy, technology startups, agricultural innovation, and education initiatives. Ava had long recognized the interconnectedness of global industries, and she sought to align her firm's investments with a future that would benefit not only the wealthy elite, but also the marginalized and underserved communities across Africa. Her firm became synonymous with sustainability, ethical business practices, and empowerment, especially for women and young entrepreneurs. She had set up mentorship programs, venture funds, and networks aimed at nurturing the next generation of African leaders. For Ava, success was no longer measured by how much money she could accumulate, but by the legacy she could leave behind. She had already built her empire. Now she was focused on building a future. Ava's influence, however, didn't just come from her financial prowess. It came from her unwavering belief that respect should be the foundation of every interaction, every negotiation, and every business venture. The handshake collapse had shown the world what happened when respect was ignored, and Ava had turned that lesson into her greatest asset. Her firm's dealings were characterized by transparency and mutual respect, and her investors, partners, and competitors knew that doing business with Ava meant entering into a relationship of trust, not just a transaction. The word respect had become synonymous with Mwangi Investments. Her approach to leadership was also reflected in the way she managed her employees. Ava made it clear that no one under her leadership was just a cog in the machine. Her team was treated as partners, with the freedom to contribute ideas and take ownership of their projects. This created a company culture that was dynamic, innovative, and deeply loyal. Ava's employees didn't just work for her, they worked with her, and they shared in the vision of building something greater than profits. Her leadership had fostered a sense of empowerment among her staff that was rare in the corporate world. They weren't simply meeting targets, they were shaping the future. Victoria Okoye, on the other hand, was still trying to pick up the pieces of her crumbling empire. Despite the failure of Mwangi Group, she was determined to make a comeback. She had retreated from the public eye after the disastrous collapse, attempting to salvage whatever credibility she had left. But the corporate world had moved on, and it was clear to Victoria that the game had changed. The old rules, the ones she had played by for so long, no longer applied. She had learned the hard way that power was not something you could take by force. It was something you had to earn through integrity, through relationship building, and through respect. Victoria's attempts to re-enter the business world were met with skepticism. No one had forgotten her role in the downfall of Mwangi Group, and the stigma that came with it was impossible to shake. Potential investors were wary of working with her, and the banks, once eager to lend her money, now kept their distance. She was now seen as a cautionary figure, a symbol of what happens when arrogance overrides respect. Her journey was no longer about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about rebuilding from the ground up, and it was clear that the path to redemption was going to be long and difficult. In the midst of her struggles, Victoria reached out to Ava, hoping to find some measure of forgiveness, or perhaps a second chance. Ava, however, had moved on. She had nothing to prove, and while she harbored no personal animosity toward Victoria, she had no interest in revisiting the past. Ava's response, however, was as measured and dignified as ever. She did not rub salt into Victoria's wounds. Instead, she simply reminded her of the key lesson. Respect is the foundation of everything we do. Without it, nothing else matters. Meanwhile, Ava's influence continued to grow. Aware of the challenges women faced in accessing leadership positions, she became an outspoken advocate for gender equality, using her position to push for policies that supported women in business. She partnered with women's rights organizations, launching initiatives that focused on creating opportunities for women in fields traditionally dominated by men. Through her work, she became not only a corporate titan, but also a symbol of empowerment for women in Africa and around the world. Ava's next major project was the creation of the Ava Mwangi Leadership Institute, a groundbreaking institution dedicated to equipping young Africans with the skills, knowledge, and networks they needed to succeed in business and leadership. The institute aimed to create a new generation of leaders who would carry forward Ava's legacy of ethical business practices, strategic innovation, and respect for others. By the time the institute opened its doors, it had already received worldwide acclaim, with thousands of young people from across Africa applying for the opportunity to study there. As Ava sat in the conference room of the institute's inaugural class, watching the bright young faces before her, she couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. The empire she had built was not just about wealth, it was about opportunity. It was about leaving behind a legacy of dignity, respect, and empowerment that would continue to shape the future of business for generations to come. Ava knew that the true measure of her success wasn't in the billions she had made, but in the lives she had touched and the leaders she had helped to inspire. She had transformed her own life, and now she was helping others to do the same. The handshake collapse had been a turning point, not just for Ava, but for the world of business itself. It was a reminder that respect, once lost, could never be bought back with money or power. It had to be earned, and when it was the most valuable asset of all. Ava Mwangi had not just rebuilt her own empire. She had changed the very foundation of corporate power, leaving behind a legacy that would endure for generations. Thank you for watching this incredible journey unfold. Ava Mwangi's story is not just a corporate triumph. It's a powerful reminder that true respect is earned, and it's the foundation of everything we do, whether in business or life. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Ava's approach and how you think respect plays a role in your own life. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories of resilience, strategy, and powerful lessons, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring episode. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest power lies in walking away with dignity. If you like this story, make sure you subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share with your friends and family so you don't miss the next powerful story coming your way. Drop a heart in comment, like and subscribe my channel, and visit my channel for more interesting story videos.